There are, in spite of all the difficulties, some people who are young people who are attracted to farming. And that is to say, they have a vocation. And something does need to be done to help them to get land, and there are efforts of that kind going on. The chances are that it won't be going on fast enough. But nevertheless, young people without farming experience are committing themselves to farming, are getting a hold of land that's marginal often, but doing well at farming. Their situation still is pretty dire because they're not making enough money from it. This raises another issue, the cheap food policy, that has been a mistake. Food's underpriced, people aren't paid well enough for producing it, and so on, which brings up another problem, which is that even cheap food is too expensive for a lot of poor people. So let's take care of that.
Well, for reasons you don't need to know about, I drove from Kansas to Chicago before catching the plane to LaGuardia. And my wife and I coming along, looking out on an April landscape where the corn has not yet been planted, or the soybeans have not been planted, and this is the time for rain. And we saw erosion, reel after reel, gullies being cut in. And we wondered to ourselves, how can it be that in Iowa and Illinois, where they're paying as much as $20,000 an acre, how can it be that there is a willingness to allow this erosion to go on? These $20,000 is a lot of money for an acre of farm ground. And if you are renting the land, then you're paying as much as not too many years ago was the price of that acre itself, just the rent. So here we have now, as the consequence of the subsidies for biofuels, which is nuts, 97 million acres of corn. That's up from around 70 million acres of corn. And the soybeans, and no fences, no livestock out there that you can see. My daughter's looked into this. She's an ecologist. She says that if we had as many dairies in Iowa as we had 30 years ago, we would not have a dead zone because there'd be pastures. That's all been turned into corn and soybeans. The dead zone wouldn't be as large. That's the way she put it. So there's something happened with this industrial mind that has taken over the landscape to the point that there's a willingness to neglect the soil that's headed down the Mississippi and into the Gulf, and the nitrogen with it, and the towns. Des Moines, I understand, had to spend something like $25 million just to clean the nitrogen out of the water to make it drinkable. So here's this nuttiness that comes partly from the subsidies that is actually exacerbating the problem. Now, just another thought here. You know, I think Wendell's the one that pointed out to me that the statement, "we must feed the world," is a kind of industrial heroism. Rather than to say the world must be fed, we say the world must be, we must feed the world. And that's an important distinction. The 9 billion, then what? You know, we're at 7 billion, going to 8 billion, and we're not asking, then what? And in the interest of doing that for the short term, we're actually leading to more famines later on of a more extensive nature. So the here and now is a part of the problem. We've got to start thinking in terms of 50 and 100 years. Wendell and I and Fred Kirschman took the 50-year Farm Bill to Washington. We sort of knew that it wouldn't go anywhere, but we thought it ought to be put out there in front of the folk. Well, some of my friends in the sustainable ag movement, working with various foundations that have been working on the 5-year farm bills, have finally sort of thrown up their hands and say, we haven't done any good, or not very much good, not enough good. What is it, something like 2/3 of 1% of the acreage is now organic, something like that. It's not much. Not that that has to be the standard in an absolute sense. I mean, I take aspirin, but I'm not a drug abuser. So it's not a matter of absolutely no chemicals. It's a matter of some, you know, be like the Greeks, golden mean or something. But we're not really addressing these questions. And I think we're not going to address them adequately as long as we have what, in computer language, forgive me, Wendell, the hardware of the annual. That we have the hardware and we design software to accommodate that hardware. With the perennial hardware, we now have the opportunity for ecology to inform a research agenda. So you know, I've been running the risk of irritating some of my friends in agronomy by saying that agronomy is what we do to mitigate the consequences of disturbance. And we need to be working toward an ecological agriculture. And I'll use this little soundbite. I got it from my late friend Chuck Washburn. If we don't get sustainability in agriculture first, it's not going to happen. Because agriculture ultimately has a discipline standing behind it of ecology, and the materials sector, the industrial sector, has no discipline to inform it. And I think we ought to look at that really hard. Really hard. And I'll say one other thing. We have pickup trucks, we have a greenhouse, we have combines, we have computers, we have a whole bunch of things in our research arsenal. A big question is, as we go through and contribute to this very problem that is all around us, will these new varieties we're developing, these new species we're developing, our colleagues in Canada, our colleagues in Australia, shoe-ins perennial wheat in 20 different spots in 8 different countries, as they are all involved in this transition, are we creating varieties and species that are going to be requiring what brought them into existence? And our answer is no. The creatureliness, or some other better word, would be available even to a Neolithic farmer. The industrial world can't say that, whether it's about wind machines or solar collectors or whatever, because the industrial world coming up with these various renewables has the scaffolding of civilization that is heavily dependent upon fossil fuel and putting it in place. So we've got to get this thought through about to what extent the ecological mind can substitute for the industrial mind.
The reason that people are not thinking about the nature of the places where they're doing their work, their agriculture, or whatever they're doing, and trying to make a harmony between the nature of the place and the human economy of that place is that we're an industrial culture. And if you want to know what an industrial culture is, it's a culture in which a farmer will pay $5,000 or $10,000 or $20,000 an acre for land and sit and watch it wash away while he takes perfect care of his machinery and his pickup truck.
I'm going to ask a political question, but it may be that you want to answer it with a cultural answer. But to go back to the David and Goliath thing, if we want to starve a beast, how do we start? If we assume that a slingshot, a single stone from a slingshot is not going to kill it, what are the institutional changes that we'd like to see happen first? What are the most important ones? Or is this, as I said, or is this a cultural question, or both?
And so I think that what we need to become is better critics. We have to have a better standard. The standard is nature. Nature is going to give us the standard. And then we begin to judge our solutions. We begin to judge the steps we've made. We begin to work our way slowly, humbly, and alertly, and pleasingly toward a better way.
Well, I'll quote Wendell. Yeah. This is from a phone conversation many years ago. And he said, we need to feature questions that go beyond the available answers in order to drive knowledge out of its categories. If you are featuring questions that don't have answers, and you take the question seriously, there's going to be a yeastiness of thought that is fundamentally different than a question that has a quick answer. You're going to be worrying with it. You're going to be broadening the considerations. And something else Wendell said several years ago. He was talking about how ultimately we're up against ignorance, and what we have is a knowledge is adequate worldview. Well, as a consequence of that conversation, which went and went and went, we put on a conference several years ago called The Virtues of Ignorance, or Toward an Ignorance-Based Worldview, and then a volume came out called The Virtues of Ignorance. What we decided is, since we're fundamentally ignorant, let's go with our long suit. Rather than knowledge is adequate, then what does that mean? Well, it forces us to remember things, hope for second chances, keep the scale small, and so on. Study the exits. Those two things, those two conversations, to me have been most useful because it helps us realize that the world of the answer has been the world that we've created and the ecosphere that we have been compromising and destroying.